I guess I'll just start now. Okay, we are on aphorism 27. Christianity grew up on this sort of false soil, where every nature, every natural value, every reality ran counter to the deepest instincts of the ruling class. Accordingly, Christianity assumed the form of a deadly hostility to reality, a hostility unsurpassed to this day. The holy people had kept up only the priestly values, priestly words for things, with terrifying logical consistency, and they had detached themselves from all other powers on earth, considering them unholy, worldly, sinful. Now, now this people introduce, sorry, now this people produced a final formula for their instinct, one that was logical to the point of self-annihilation. As Christianity, they negated the final form of reality, the holy people, the chosen people, Jewish reality itself. It is a first-rate case. The small rebel movement, christened with the name of Jesus of Nazareth, is the Jewish instinct once again. In other words, the priestly instinct that could no longer tolerate priests for its reality. The invention of an existence that is even more threadbare, of a worldview that is even more unreal than what is dictated by the organization of a church. Christianity negates the church. This rebellion that Jesus has been understood or misunderstood to have caused, I cannot imagine what it was directed against, if not the Jewish church, using the word church in precisely the sense we understand it today. It was a rebellion against the good and the just. Again, against the saints of Israel, against the social hierarchy, not against its corruption, but rather against caste, privilege, order, formula. It was a refusal to believe in higher men, a no said to everything priestly or theologian-like. But the hierarchy that was put into question, however briefly, was the house on stilts that had allowed the Jewish people to survive in the middle of the water. It was the last hard-won chance for survival, the residuum of their independent political existence. An attack on this was an attack on the deepest instinct, on the most stubborn will to life that had ever existed in any people on earth. The holy anarchist who called out to the lowly people, the outcasts and the sinners, the chandala within Judaism, telling them to protest against the dominant order with the speech that Israels are to be trusted, would get you banished to Siberia even today. This holy anarchist was a political criminal to the extent that political criminals were possibly in an absurdly apolitical society. This is what brought him to the cross. The proof is written on the cross. He died for his own guilt. No matter how many times people say it, there is simply no evidence that he died for anyone else's guilt. Any questions? I mean, I guess the last line is pretty, pretty damning, right? He died for his own guilt. No matter how many times people say it, there is simply no evidence that he died for anyone else's guilt, right? He died because right, he was a political criminal, right? He died for his own sins, not for anyone else's, is I guess what it's saying. Um, yeah, there's a lot in here though. Um, where I believe it's like the Christianity taking over like the Jewish church, right? Where we're talking about like this false soil that Christianity grew out of is like what was left over from Judaism before Christianity kind of took over and made it, made it more made it more extreme, I guess. And this rebellion that Jesus has been understood and misunderstood to have caused is that I believe, like Jesus as a Jew, like rebelled against like the Jewish customs to create like Christianity. But where he's saying he might have been misunderstood, I think Nietzsche is implying that um that like Christianity doesn't really like Jesus isn't really like the cause of Christianity, right? He's kind of like falsely attributed maybe. Because I believe he does go on to say that he like admires Jesus as like well, I'm not gonna get ahead of myself. We'll get there when we get there. Yes, it's a very interesting passage. Okay, number 28. It is a completely different question whether this sort of opposition was what he had in mind, or whether he was just seen as representing this opposition. And this brings me to the problem of the psychology of the Redeemer. I have to admit, there are not many books I found as difficult as the Gospels. My difficulties aren't different from those demonstrated by the scholarly curiosity of the German spirit in one of its most unforgettable triumphs. The days are long gone, when, like every young scholar, I took great pleasure in the work of the inimitable Strauss, read at the shrewd and plodding place of a refined philologist. I was 20 then. Now I'm too serious for this. What do I care about the contradictions in this tradition? In the tradition, and besides, how can anyone call saints as legends as tradition? The stories of the saints are the most ambiguous pieces of literature in existence. To apply scientific method to them in the absence of any other record seems to me like a project that is doomed from the start. Just scholars wasting time. So here at the beginning, I do believe he's talking about Jesus, and had he was kind of like misappropriated as representing like the Christian movement. And this brings me to the psychology of the Redeemer, which is interesting. I don't yeah. Hopefully he touches up on psychology of the Redeemer at some point because it's not a phrase I've heard from him. But yeah, so here he's just very much questioning like the validity of the Gospels and whether or not they're possible to examine as like through like an anthropologist or philologist like view. What's that give? Oh yeah, from is that from Life of Brian? Yeah, that's nice. Sorry. Okay. Um. Okay. Unless anyone has any questions, I'm gonna move on to 29. Okay, I see someone typing. Oh, I was hoping I'd get the Sermon on the Mount scene given the gospel commentary. Oh yeah, you couldn't find it? Is that yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I have to admit I've not actually watched Life of Brian. I probably should though. Yeah, number 29. What I do care about is the psychological type of the Redeemer. After all, the Gospels might actually provide information on this point, in spite of themselves, however garbled or crammed with alien features it might be. Just as a psychology of Francis of Assisi can be found in his legends, in spite of themselves. Not the truth of what he did, what he said, how he really died, but rather the question, can we even conceive of this type anymore? Has it been passed down? The attempts that I have seen to read the Gospels even as the history of a soul are proof to me of a hateful sort of psychological thoughtlessness. Mr. Renan, this buffoon in psychologist, I don't know, imported the most inappropriate concepts imaginable into his explanation of Jesus' type, the concept of genius and that of hero. But if anything is unevangelical, it is the concept of a hero. The polar opposite of struggle, of any feeling of doing battle, has become instinct here, and incapacity for resistance has become morality here. Resist not evil, the most profound saying of the gospel, the key to their meaning in a certain sense. Blessedness in peace, the gentleness in an inability to be an enemy. What are the glad tidings? That the true life, the eternal life has been found. It is not just a promise, it exists. It is in each of you, as a life of love, as a love without exceptions or rejections, without distance. Everyone is a child of God. Jesus did not claim any special privileges. As a child of God, everyone is equal to everyone else. And to make Jesus into a hero, even this word, genius, what a misunderstanding it is. Our whole nation, our cultural notion of spirit, made absolutely no sense in the world where Jesus lived. The rigorous language of physiology would use a different word here, the word idiot. We are familiar with a condition where the sense of touch is pathologically oversensitive and recoils from all contact, from grasping any solid objects. Just follow the sort of physiological habitus to its ultimate consequences, as an instinct of hatred for every reality, as a flight into the unimaginable, into the inconceivable, as an aversion to every formula, to every concept of space and time, to everything solid, to every custom, institution, church, as a being at home in a world that has broken up contact with every type of reality, world that has become completely internal, a true world, an eternal world. The kingdom of God is in each of you. And footnote 11 here is just follow this sort of physiological condition. Um, so yeah, there's a lot going on here. So I believe here he is saying, Jesus did not claim any special privileges as a child of God. Everyone is equal to everyone else, and to make Jesus into a hero. So he's saying like when this guy, Mr. Renan, supposedly like an anthropologist of some sort. Actually, I'm not sure. Um, he kind of gave Jesus like the archetype of like a hero. And what Nietzsche, I believe, is saying is that since like in the Bible, Jesus does not have any special privilege. Everyone else is also a child of God. So calling him a hero is kind of removing a lot of the point, right? Even this word genius, what a misunderstanding it is. Our whole notion, our cultural notion of spirit made absolutely no sense in the world where Jesus lived. The rigorous language of physiology would use a different word here, the word idiot. Um, I mean that I so I believe what he's getting at here is that to call him a genius, we would have to go like retroactively, right? Because obviously, like Jewish and Christian morality was able to win in the end. So him defying like the current moral system, like to go towards like the more godly one, would be genius, right? He's breaking away from the tradition to go towards something more true or whatever. But that's only if you do it retroactively. In his day, I guess he's saying that he would have been called an idiot for like resisting like the moral like reality of the world that he was living in. That's my take on it anyway. I'm not too confident on that. If anyone has any thoughts on that, feel free. Just follow this sort of physiological condition to its ultimate consequences, is an instinctive hatred in every reality, as a flight into the unimaginable, into the inconceivable, as an aversion to every formula, to every concept of space and time, to everything solid, to every custom, institution, church, as a being at home in a world that has broken off contact into every type of reality, a world that has become completely internal, a true world, an eternal world. The kingdom of God is in each of you. Um, Let me try to figure out what he's saying here. Familiar with a condition where the sense of touch is pathologically oversensitive and recoils from all contacts, from grasping any solid objects. So I think he's saying here, like it's hard. I think he is talking about Jesus here when he's saying that he was unable to grasp any solid objects, right? Like he was unable to say in like his current world, and he could only just keep dreaming of like the world that was inside of him, right? I think that's kind of what he's going for. Maybe. Again, I'm not too confident about this one. I hopefully, he makes it more clear later what he's getting at. For now, since there's nothing in chat, I'm gonna move on to number 30. The instinct of hatred for reality. The consequence of an extreme oversensitivity and capacity for suffering that does not want to be touched at all because it feels every contact too acutely. The instinctive exclusion of all aversion, all hostility, all boundaries and distances and feelings, the consequence of an extreme oversensitivity and capacity for suffering that perceives every reluctance, every needing to be reluctant, as itself an unbearable pain, which is to say, harmful, prescribed by the instinct of self-preservation. It only experiences bliss, pleasure, when it stops resisting everyone and anything, including evil. Love as the only, the final possibility for life. These are the two physiological realities out of which the doctrine of redemption has grown. I call it a subsequent and refined development of hedonism as a thoroughly morbid foundation. Its closest relation is Epicureanism, paganism's doctrine of redemption. Although Epicureanism, for a strong dose of Greek vitality and nerves, Epicurus is a typical decadent. I was the first to recognize this. The fear of pain, even of infinitesimal amounts of pain, this could end up only as a religion of love. Hmm. Instinctive hatred for reality, the consequence of an extreme oversensitivity and capacity for suffering that does not want to be touched at all because it feels every contact too acutely. So, this one's a little interesting for me. I guess he's the instinct of hatred for reality, right? He's saying like this kind of right, like it goes back to here, right? We are familiar with the condition where the sense of touch is pathologically oversensitive and recoils from all contact, from grasping any solid objects, right? Where they're just kind of like disgusted by the entirety of like just the entire world basically, anything that's outside themselves, and they just keep like recoiling back and back into themselves. And this is right, this could only end up as a religion of love, right? Which I believe is like the a common way to refer to the Christianity, right, as a religion of love. So I guess he's saying like that's why it ends up being that, is because they're so like disgusted with the outside world, right? The fear of pain, even infinitesimal amounts of pain, right? This could end up only as religion of love. I think I'm gonna move on to 31. Um, yeah. I have already given away the answer to my problem. It presupposes that the type of the Redeemer has been preserved for us only in a distorted form. This distortion is in itself very plausible. There are many reasons why a type like this could not have stayed pure, whole, or free of embellishments. The environment where this strange figure moved must have left its traces on him, but even more, the type would have been marked by the history, the destiny of the first Christian community, and retroactively enhanced with features that can only be understood as emerging from war intended as propaganda. The strange, sick world that the Gospels introduced to us, a world like a Russian novel, where the dregs of society, nerve cases, and childlike idiocy all seem to converge. This world, in any case, would have coarsened the type, the first discipline in particular. When faced with a being awash in symbols and incomprehensibilities, they had to translate it into their own crudeness in order to make head or tail of it. The type did not exist for them until they had reduced it to familiar forms. The prophet, the Messiah, the future judge, the teacher of morality, the miracle worker, John the Baptist, all so many opportunities for mistaking the type. Finally, we should not underestimate the proprium, which is characteristic. We should not underestimate the characteristic of all great, which is to say all sectarian worship. It effaces the initial, often embarrassingly foreign features and idiosyncrasies from the object of worship. It does not even see them. It is a pity that there was no Dostoevsky living near this most interesting decadent. I mean, someone with an eye for the distinctive charm that the sort of mixture of sublimity, sickness, and childishness has to offer. A final aspect to be noted. Being decadent, the type could not, in fact, have been peculiarly diverse and contradictory. This possibly cannot be completely ruled out. Nonetheless, everything speaks against this. The tradition would have had to be strangely faithful and objective if this were the case, and we have evidence to the contrary. Meanwhile, there is a gaping contradiction between, on the other hand, the preacher from the mountain sea and meadows, who appeared like a Buddha on soil that was not very Indian, and, on the other hand, the fanatic of aggression, the mortal enemy of the theologians and priests, snidely celebrated by Renan as El Grand Maitre de en Ironie, the great master of irony. For my part, I have no doubt that the turbulent state of Christian propaganda infused the type of the master with ample quantities of bile, and even spirit. Everyone knows how sectarians won't think twice before turning their masters into their own apologetics. When the first congregation needed a judging, quarrelsome, wrathful, malicious, nitpicking theologian to use against theologians, they created a god to fit these requirements, just as they did not hesitate to put words into his mouth. Those totally evangelical word sorry, those totally unevangelical words that they could not do without. Second coming, last judgment. Every type of temporal expectation and promise. Okay, so I guess let me try to unpack this first. So he's kind of tracing what might have happened to what he calls Jesus's type, right? The type of the Redeemer, right? And it has I believe he's saying that it was preserved, but only in like a distorted form. And later on here, he says that it was, yeah, this world in any case would have been coarsened the type. The first disciples in particular, when faced with a being awash in symbols and incomprehensibilities, they had to translate it into their own crudeness in order to make head or tail of it. So it was the type of the Redeemer was very much like was lost when it was like translated into like familiar language, right? It was reduced to its familiar forms: the prophet, the Messiah, the future judge, the teacher of morality, the miracle worker, John the Baptist. All so many opportunities for mistaking the type, right? So the type of the Redeemer was like kind of um like I don't want to say like dumbed down, but it was very much like changed and became more crude, like to be able to fit with like their like existing language. I have no doubt that the turbulent state of Christian propaganda infused the type of the master with ample quantities of bile. Everyone knows how sectarians won't think twice before turning their masters into their own apologetics. Right? So he's saying like the like to keep Christianity going, they had to kind of transform like the image of Jesus into something that it wasn't, something that would like excuse and be in favor of what the priests were doing. Is I believe what he's getting at there. Right. When the first congregation needed a judge and quarrelsome, wrathful, malicious, nitpicking theologian to use against theologians, they created a god to fit these requirements, just as they did not hesitate to put words into his mouth. Those totally unevangelical words that they could not do without. Second coming, last judgment. So kind of the entire image of Jesus in like, you know, the way people talk about him kind of comes from like theologians and priests and like all of those people who kind of needed an image that would approve of them and keep them going. Okay, I'm gonna move on to 32. It bears repeating that I am against introducing the fanatic into the type of the Redeemer. Renan's term imperia nullifies the type all by itself. The glad tidings are just that the contradiction is gone. The kingdom of heaven belongs to the children. The faith expressed here is not a hard-won faith. It is here. It has been from the start. It is, as it were, an infantilism that has receded into spirituality. Physiologists, at least, are familiar with cases where delayed puberty is the result of an organism's degeneration. A faith like this does not get angry, does not lay blame, does not defend itself, does not brandish the sword, does not have the slightest suspicion that it might ever separate things from each other. It does not prove itself with miracles, rewards, or promises, certainly not through scriptures. At every moment, it is its own miracle, its own reward, its own proof, its own kingdom of God. This faith does not formulate itself either. It lives, it resists formulas. Of course, accidents of environment, language, and context will dictate a determinate sphere of concepts. The first form of Christianity dealt only with Jewish Semitic concepts. The eating and drinking at the Last Supper is one such concept, one that was badly misused by the Church, which misused everything Jewish. But you should guard against seeing this as more than a sign language, a semiology, as an opportunity for allegories, an excuse for parables. For this anti-realist speech is made possible precisely by not taking words literally. Among Indians, he would have used the Sankhya concepts. Let me just see what the footnote is. Sankhya is a Hindu system of philosophy. He would not have used the Sankhya concepts among Chinese, the concept of Lao Tse, Taoist concepts, and never known the difference. Jesus could not be called a free spirit, using the phrase somewhat loosely. He does not care for solid things. The word kills. Everything solid kills. The concept, the experience of life, as only he knew it, repelled every type of word, formula, law, faith, or dogma. He spoke only about what was inside of him, most deeply. Life, or truth, or light, are his words for the innermost. He saw everything else, the whole of reality, the whole of nature, language itself, as having value only as a sign, a parable. It is very important to be clear about this. However great the temptation of Christian, and I should say ex ecclesiastical, I don't know how to pronounce that at all, sorry, um, prejudice really is. The sort of symbolism, par excellence, is positioned outside all religion, all cult concepts, all history, all natural science, all experience of the world, all knowledge, all politics, all psychology, all books, all art. His knowing is just pure stupidity concerning the fact that things like this exist. He does not know anything about culture, even in passing. He does not need to struggle against it. He does not negate it. The same is true about the state, about the whole civic order in society, about work, about war. He never had any reason to negate the world. The ecclesiastical concept of world never occurred to him. Negation is out of the equation for him. Dialectic is missing as well. There is no concept that a belief, a truth, could be grounded in reason. His proofs are in inner lights, our inner lights, inner feelings of pleasure, and self-affirmations, pure proofs of strength. A doctrine like this cannot contradict. It has no idea that there could be any other doctrines. It has no idea how even to form the thought of an opposing judgment. If it comes across an opposing judgment, it will feel deeply sympathetic and grieve over this blindness, since it sees the light, but would not offer any objections. I mean, so I might be overstepping myself, but this seems like a pretty, glowing review of Jesus. I think he's pretty happy with with it, right? Like he's using these words like proofs of strength, right? Inner feelings of pleasure and self-affirmations, right? Like he's not doing anything as a negation. He's not doing anything out of reaction. He's just simply, like doing as he does, right? The going the path of least resistance. Then he's saying like the Christian prejudice like kind of twists it into something else.
There would be a lack of decadence for Jesus then.
Yeah, I believe that's yeah, I believe that would be I believe Nietzsche would agree with that.
Nice. Just trying to make sure I understand it as I go.
Yeah. Faith expression. Faith of this does not get angry, does not lay blame, does not defend itself. Right. This is like right, it doesn't like do like doesn't like lash out, doesn't like it's very much like not resentment, right? Which is but clearly now after like the influence of Christianity and then the church and like and whatnot, it just turned very much into resentment. But this is kind of it in its pure like natural form, I guess is kind of what's going on.
This almost reminds me of the last Klazowski chapter we read, and on that reading about the gregarious types in the singular.
Yeah, I wish I was keeping up with Klosowski.
Dude, it's
I
so good.
Yeah, I should probably start at some point just so I can catch up, but right now it doesn't seem possible.
Yeah.
Um, Jesus could be called a free spirit, using the phrase somewhat loosely. He does not care for solid things. The word kills. Everything solid kills. The concept, the experience of life, as only he knew it, repelled every type of word. Right? It's like his life kind of like repelled any kind of like anything that try to like categorize it or like stamp it down. Which obviously, as we see, is what Christianity does. Like they tell you to kind of be like Jesus and do what Jesus did, but without like emphasizing like experience of life, right? They kind of categorize it into like a bunch of like mantras and like quick rules and axioms. So I think that's what he's gonna where he's gonna go with that. Okay, I feel good about moving on to 33. The concepts of guilt and punishment are completely missing from the psychology of the evangel. So is the concept of reward. Sin, any distance between God and man. These are abolished. This is what the glad tidings are all about. Blessedness is not a promise. It has no strings attached. It is the only reality. Everything else is just a symbol used to speak about it. The state projects itself into a new practice, the genuinely evangelical practice. Christians are not categorized by their faith. Christians act. They are categorized by a different way of acting, by the fact that they do not offer any resistance, in their words or in their heart, to people who are evil to them, by the fact that they do not make any distinction between foreigners and natives, between Jews and non-Jews. The neighbor is really the co-religionist, the Jew, by the fact that they do not get angry at someone, or any, sorry, the fact they do not get angry at anyone or belittle anyone, by the fact that they do not let themselves be seen in or involved with, sworn in, to courts of law, by the fact that they would not get a divorce under any circumstances, even when the wife has been proven unfaithful. All of this is fundamentally a single proposition. All of this is the result of a single instinct. The life of the Redeemer is nothing other than this practice. Even his death was nothing else. He no longer needed formulas, rites for interacting with God, or even prayer. He had settled his accounts with the whole Jewish doctrine of atonement and reconciliation. He knew how the practice of life is the only thing that can make you feel divine, blessed, evangelical, like a child of God at all times. Atonement and praying and forgiveness are not the way to God. Only the evangelical practice leads to God. In fact, it is God. What the evangel did away with was the Judaism of the concepts of sin, forgiveness of sin, faith, redemption through faith. A whole Jewish church doctrine was ejected in the glad tidings. The profound instinct of how we must live to feel as if we were in heaven, to feel as if we were eternal, given that we do not feel remotely as if we are in heaven when we behave in any other ways. This, and this alone, is the psychological reality of redemption, a new way of life, not a new faith. So I mean here I feel like he's kind of like going on the same thing, right? Like he's showing how different Jesus is than like what Christians like seem to take away from him, right? Like he's emphasizing like it as like a way of life, and it as like removing like the concepts of sin, like all the like decadent concepts that build resentment, right? Right.
Yeah. Well, there's like almost this thing of like forgiveness in this chapter where it's like um you'll hear stories about like some somebody murders somebody else and then the family is Christians and they just say, "Okay, I forgive you."
Yeah. Well, that is actually what I was gonna, because I'm a bit confused because it seems like he's talking about like Christians as a whole, right? But I mean, this is right. Christians are not characterized by their faith. Christians actually are characterized by a different way of acting. And I mean, because we know from other readings that he's not a huge fan of the way Christians act. But it sounds like he's being positive about it, which to me seems very weird. So I'm not sure what that's about, right? I don't. Does that like? Is anyone else noticing
Yeah,
that?
yeah. I almost wonder if that's like a yeah, he's giving like a cultural commentary. I
I mean,
kind of understand what he's saying, but it's
He's he's
what was
he's
that?
painting Jesus more in a more positive or sympathetic light than he is institutional Christianity and the priests, and how when they took over and reinterpreted his sayings that they introduced all these things that he is critiquing. But that doesn't mean that he's giving Jesus a clean slate. You can think of it. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of kind of the way that at times he praises Buddhism. And compares it positively to Christianity, but that doesn't mean that he's giving Buddhism a clean slate either. In both
Yeah.
cases, I think he's saying that Jesus's way of thinking is still a form of decadence. It's still kind of a withdrawal in the face of suffering and conflict rather than an embrace of it. So Jesus is not able to really kind of embrace the world um, the way that Nietzsche is, advocating, but he's still, he's a step above, institutional Christianity.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like he's saying like Jesus was still able to navigate in like a way that was like healthy, right? Is that also going too far?
Well, healthier. There's about, so he would say that Jesus is anti-political and anti-historical because he withdraws from power, law, and struggle. But that's not a
Yeah.
strength for Nietzsche. That's a kind of an incapacity to engage, life. And then the second sort of implicit critique is that Jesus's love is indifferent to justice, which means there's no affirmation of sort of hierarchy, rank, or greatness. Everything is leveled in universal compassion. And so that's not consistent with Nietzsche's approach either. Also, Jesus, the way that he distinguishes Jesus from priestly ressentiment, um, that's still a form of a decadence, not in the same way as the priest, but because it's still turning away from worldly vitality in favor of this inward bliss.
Yeah, yeah. I think that makes sense.
So you're
Yeah.
saying Jesus is more acting in his nature and is not really being decadent, but he's being maybe weak, and the Christian is being decadent because they're forcing themselves to align with Jesus.
Um, Jesus is well. Jesus. Well, I would say that Jesus's form of decadence isn't as. It's not as weak. It's not as sick as the
Well,
priests.
it's not
So
like
what?
delimitating, right? Like he's still like right. I actually yeah, it's kind of hard to phrase, but it's definitely better, like in some sense, the way he's
So
Yeah.
describing it.
So it's a church after Jesus that invented kind of this metaphysics of sin, the afterlife, and
right.
judgment. Um, so in a certain sense, Jesus is like almost beyond good and evil, whereas Christianity becomes, like severely moralistic.
Yeah.
So what is in Jesus' actions that would be decadent then? Because he
Well,
thinks he's
it's
the
Uh,
Messiah.
well he's blocking off like the outside world, right? Like as right, he says like anything like even remotely painful, is too much for him to bear, right? He kind of like blocks everything off. He's unable to like interact with culture or
Oh, so
society
he's still okay. Yeah,
or
he's
any
still
political
thinking
project.
together. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
I do wonder though, like 'cause right here where the way that it uses Christians here, it almost seems like they're not talking about like what we would call Christians. Like they're saying like people who act as Christ, right? Rather than like because like here it's being like it's kind of describing Christians as if they were Jesus, right? Rather than what Christians would be today, which is nothing like Jesus.
Yeah, yeah,
So I
definitely.
think this might be using the word differently. I don't know if is
Well,
that fair to
I was
say?
think what I was thinking earlier was like when I would go to church as a kid, they would always be talking about like people who call themselves Christian versus people who act Christ-like was one of those little sayings that they had. But also, I think as time has passed, like through the evolution of like Protestantism into capitalism and all that, that it's just like far less. Uh, I mean, it almost resembles none of it at all. It's like a whole new thing at this point.
right? The life of the Redeemer was nothing other than this practice, right? We're talking about like the way the Christians act. So he's saying like so I think he is saying like Christian as in Christ like, not as in like what we would call Christians today, which is kind of confusing here, right? So
Hmm.
that's why I'm hesitant to say that, but it does seem like he's using the word differently than he does everywhere else.
Yeah, he does that sometimes. Where he'll just use the same word with different definitions.
Yeah. I also wonder if there's a translation difference where it's like in German and had a different,
Oh,
slightly different word.
let me look up the Italian one.
Because yeah, I know that happens a lot with German at least.
Which was
Not sure
this?
about the
30?
specific. This is page 30, aphorism 33.
Look real quick. 33. What was
Yeah.
the word we're looking for? Christians.
The second paragraph, right? The
State.
Christians act. Christians are not categorized by their faith.
The results of such a state project. Maybe, wait, is that right?
Yeah,
Themselves into a new practice of life, the actual evangelical practice. It is not a faith which distinguishes the Christian. The Christian acts, he distinguishes himself by means of different mode of action. Is that about,
it's
that's
it's
about
it's
close enough.
phrased very differently, but it is like yeah, but it's pretty much the same as far as using the same
Yeah,
words.
projects versus practice, that's kind of the only difference. Christian acts,
Okay,
Christian.
so I do think this first sentence is a hint, right? The state projects itself into a new practice, the genuine evangelical practice. So he's talking about like kind of so it is talking about like a different form of Christians, like what Christians are. I guess like I don't know, like I guess I would say like conceptualized, right? What they're like intended to be, rather than like what we would call Christians now or what most people are. I guess is how I phrase
Yeah,
it. But
that's
yeah,
not
it's
one of those
still very
things.
strange. Yeah.
When I was in church, they'd always talk about faith, like you need faith, but you also need acts, or like they call it works. Like you can have faith, but you also like want miracles. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if that's what he's talking about here, but I
I,
think he's
I
like in the culture of the Christianity. Like you have to have that point of view.
yeah. I think he'll probably this is probably going to be something he talks about a lot. So I think if we move on, we'll learn more pretty quickly. Um, if I understand anything about this great symbolism, it is that he accepted only inner realities, as truths. That he considered everything else, everything natural, temporal, spatial, historical, to be just a sign, an excuse for a parable. The concept "son of man" is not some concrete person belonging to history, someone individual or unique, but rather an eternal eternal facticity, a psychological symbol that has been redeemed from the concept of time. The same holds true again and in the highest sense for the kingdom of God, this typical symbolism. For the kingdom of God, sorry, let me read that last sentence. The same holds true again in the highest sense for the God of this typical symbolist, for the kingdom of God, for the kingdom of heaven, and for the filial relation to God. Nothing is less Christian than the ecclesiastical crudity of God as a person, of a kingdom of God that is yet to come, the kingdom of heaven in the beyond, a Son of God as a second person in the Trinity. This is all, if you will excuse the expression, one big fist in the eye. The German phrase "fist in the eye" means a misfit, two things that do not go together well.
Hmm.
That's fun. And what an eye it is of the Evangel, uh, a world historical cynicism in the derision of symbols. But it is obvious, although probably not to everyone, that the signs Father and Son suggest the word Son expresses the entrance into a feeling of the total transfiguration of all things, blessedness, and the word Father expresses this feeling itself, the feeling of eternity, of perfection. I am ashamed to think that the Church has made out of this symbolism. Hasn't it stuck on uh, Amphitrion's story? Let me read that. Amphitryon is a character in Greek myth whose virgin bride is seduced by Zeus. Hasn't it stuck in Amphitrion's story on the threshold to the Christian faith, in a dogma of immaculate conception into the bargain? But this but this just maculates the conception. The kingdom of heaven is a state of the heart, not something lying above the earth or coming after death. The whole idea of a natural death is missing from the eventual. Death is not a bridge, not a transient, or not a transition. Okay. Um, where was I? Sorry, that was a bit of a noise.
Death is not a bridge.
Oh, I accidentally went back up. Death is not a bridge, not a transition. It is absent because it belongs to an entirely different, merely apparent world that is useful only as a symbol. The hour of death is not a Christian concept. Hours, time, and the physical life with its crisis, just do not exist for the teacher of the glad tidings. The kingdom of God is not something that you wait for. Does not have a yesterday or a day after tomorrow. It will not arrive in 1,000 years. It is an experience of the heart. It is everywhere and it is nowhere. So, yeah, I mean, it's very much talking. What'd you say?
The kingdom of heaven is not a destination; it's a place in your heart. It's like a Christian mystic thing.
Yeah, or it's just like the way that you live, right? It's not something that you wait for. It does not have a yesterday after tomorrow. It will not arrive in 1,000 years. An experience of the heart is, but it's an experience of the heart. Is everyone is nowhere. Like it's just the way that you live your life,
Right.
right? It's not something spatial or temporal. It's just like existing itself. I guess is how I'd phrase it.
Yeah, it's like existing in the good. Uh, I used to study that kind of thing, like neighborly hearted. How do you phrase it in German? Good-hearted neighborliness, I guess you might say, like communion. Like, yeah.
It's so I want to also go back here. Nothing is less Christian than the. Actually, I want to look up what. Let me just look up what the ecclesiastical
Oh yeah, ecclesiastical.
of a relating to the church. Okay, that would have been useful to know. So yeah, the like to the truth personifies God as a person of a kingdom of God that is yet to come, a kingdom of heaven. So they're saying like the church like very much perverts this idea, right? Jesus did not live as someone like waiting for for heaven or someone who's like just like the right they didn't right it's very different. Like God was inside of Jesus, right? And the kingdom of heaven was also inside of Jesus, right? He did not live like waiting for for God or for the kingdom of heaven to come down.
Right. It's lived. There's like a phrase in this saying in the Bible of Jesus, like, where there are two or three of you, there I am. Like there's God. Like it's a social thing, not like a literal place.
What the sign Father and Son suggest. The word Son expresses the entrance into the feeling of the total transfiguration of all things, blessedness, and the word Father expresses this feeling itself, the feeling of eternity of perfection. I'm kind of confused on a world historical cynicism and the derision of symbols, but it is obvious, though not to everyone with this. So I guess he's saying like what why the church like signifies like God as the Father and Jesus as the Son. Right, the Son expresses the entrance to the feeling of the total transfiguration of all things, blessedness, and the word Father expresses this feeling itself, the feeling of eternity and perfection. I am ashamed to think that the church has made out of this symbolism, hasn't it stuck in its door into the threshold of to the Christian faith, dogma of immaculate conception to the bargain, but this just maculates the conception. Let me look up maculates.
Yeah. Immaculate conception is born without sin.
Yeah, but okay, but the word maculate is like blotched or ruined or like stained,
Right.
which yeah makes sense. But this just maculates the conception, right? It like
Immaculate.
it kind of I guess like he's saying like it ruins it, right? The dogma of the immaculate conception into the bargain, but this just maculates the conception.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm not too it is kind of hard to tell like what he's getting at with like the
Son
figure out what
expresses
like the father and son like
entrance.
symbolizes.
Blessedness. The Father expresses this feeling itself.
Right, and then
Yeah.
whose virgin bride is seduced by Zeus. Whose virgin bride is seduced by Zeus?
So what is being seduced by the godly figure? I am ashamed to think that the church has made out of the symbol, hasn't it stuck and seduction story on the threshold of Christian faith. So God, like the image of God is seducing, maybe.
I'm not sure either. All I can think about is like like kind of like Oedipal relations with like the father and son, but obviously this is after Nietzsche, so I don't know if
Right.
that
I
makes
was just
any
thinking about
sense.
like looking on. Hmm. Yeah. Well, Nietzsche's father was a priest, pastor, right? So I think his
That's fair.
understanding of all this was like, even though grew up Christian, it was like his understanding is way deeper than mine because I wasn't really paying attention to church that much.
Yeah, I think that's something we'd have to go back to. There's
Yeah.
definitely a lot going on there, but I don't really get what he's getting at, unfortunately. How much time do we have?
I gotta run to work actually, so I'll see y'all.
Okay. Bye bye. Okay, it is 1:30. Brooks's thing starts at 2, so I think we can do a couple more, but that'll
Okay.
probably be it for the day. Let me just wait for Kat to finish typing. The last time I was at church, I had to hear the priest argue that the crucifixion is a redemption from sin rather than conviction to it. Was a redemption from sin rather than a conviction to it. All right, like yeah. So like one of the few aphorisms ago, where Nietzsche says, Jesus died for his own sins, not for anyone else's. I guess like yeah. So your priest was saying like the opposite of that. I mean, I from like the tone, I assume the priest wasn't making any great points, was he? I think he was trying to go against the brimstone idea towards a gentler notion. That's yeah. That's yeah. So you can see like they're still trying to twist it to whatever is kind of like convenient for the church, right? Or for like the audience in the church. That's kind of what I'm getting from it, at least. Okay, I'm gonna do 35 and okay, well these are pretty short. I think I can do up to 39 and then I'll stop. Okay, 35. This bearer of great tidings died the way he lived, the way he thought, not to redeem humanity, but instead to demonstrate how people need to live. His his bequest to humanity was a practice. His behavior towards the judges, towards the henchmen, the way he acted in the face of his accusers, and every type of slander and derision, his conduct on the cross. He does not offer any resistance. He does not defend his rights. He does not make a single move to avert the worst. What is more, he invites it, and he begs, he suffers, he loves with those people who did him evil. The whole evangel is contained in the words to the thieves on the cross. That was a truly divine man, a child of God, said the thief. If this is how you feel, the Redeemer replied, then you are in paradise, and you too are a child of God. Not to defend yourself, not to get angry, not to lay blame, but not to resist evil either, to love it. That's a, pretty small, simple passage, right? Like he's going back to that idea, right, that Jesus died like wait, sorry, I gotta sneeze 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. Like he's saying, Jesus like died like right, like him dying in the cross was not like for other people's sins. It was just to show other people how to live, right? Even like his words when he was on the cross was just still doing the same thing. right? It was not to redeem humanity, but instead to demonstrate how people need to live. 36. We alone, we spirits who have become free, have the requisite presuppositions for understanding what 19th centuries have misunderstood. The honesty that has become instinct and passion, that which is born the holy lie above all other lies. People People have been unspeakably far removed from our affectionate and conscious neutrality, from the from the discipline of spirit needed to figure out such strange, such delicate matters with unabashed selfishness. People have always wanted only what was the best for themselves. People have constructed the church out of the opposite of the evangel. Anyone looking for signs that an unironic divinity is keeping his fingers in the great game of the world will find them in the enormous question mark called Christianity. The fact that humanity knelt down before the opposite of the origin, the meaning, the right of the evangel, the fact that in the concept of church, humanity cannot canonize the very thing the bearer of glad tidings felt to be beneath him, behind him. You will not find the great example of world historical irony. So yeah, I mean, just kind of, going over the same thing, right? Christianity, like the way that like the church like interprets what Jesus did is the exact opposite of what he was trying to get people to do, right? It's just it's like a yeah. I guess that's yeah. Just okay, it's 1:30 now. Okay. 37. Our age is proud of its historical sense. So how could it convince itself of this piece of nonsense that Christianity began with this crude fable of a miracle worker and a redeemer, and that everything spiritual and symbolic developed only later on? To the contrary, the history of Christianity, starting in fact with the death on the cross, is the story of the progressively cruder misunderstanding of an original symbolism. Every time Christianity expanded to greater and cruder masses of people whose presuppositions were increasingly remote from the presupposition under which it arose, it became increasingly necessary to vulgarize Christianity and make it barbaric. Christianity soaked up doctrine and rites from all the subterranean cults of the Imperium Romanum and bits of nonsense from all kinds of sick reasons. Christianity's faith was fated to become as sick, base, and vulgar as the sick, base, and vulgar needs it catered to. Sorry. Christianity's faith was fated to become as sick, base, and vulgar as the sick, base, and vulgar needs it catered to. It's very would not have written the sentence like that personally, but uh, sick barbarism itself finally achieved power in the church. The church, this sorry, Sikh barbarism itself finally achieved power in the Church. The Church, this form of deadly hostility to everything honest, to every height of the soul, to every discipline of spirit, to everything kind and candid in humanity. Christian values, noble values, we alone, we spirits, who have become free, have restored the opposition, the greatest opposition of values there is. So, a while back ago, I don't remember what aphorism, but he kind of talked about how the Christian God was kind of expanded to like include every people, and the way that it kind of did like that colonization. So this is very much going back to it, right? To since eventually Christianity had to move on to targeting quote unquote like barbaric people, right? Um, it had to become more vulgar and more crude and like kind of go back against like everything it was supposed to be, right? The church, this form deadly hostility to everything honest, to every height of the soul, to every discipline of spirit, to everything kind and canon humanity, Christian values, noble values, we alone, we spirits who have become free, have restored the opposition, the greatest opposition of values there is.
I'm kind of wondering why Nietzsche, why was sort of important to him to kind of make this distinction between an individual who happens to be Jesus, who he's sort of praising here, right, and then this like incredibly stark contrast between him and these sort of the institutional history that kind of springs up after him. I mean, it makes me think a little bit about sort of the this distinction that Nietzsche also makes, and maybe the preference between the individual versus the herd, right? And here he happens to sort of maybe he's choosing Nietzsche as Jesus as an example, and maybe it doesn't even matter so much to Nietzsche whether this actual person called Jesus represented these values that he's attributing to him, but he wants to set him up here as a kind of a foil against sort of what happens when you have this sort of this herd instinct that kind of comes into play, and then that gives Nietzsche an opportunity to kind of to illustrate how that takes place, right? How this institutional Christianity becomes further and further removed from anything that that might have positive values associated with it. I mean, it's just a thought, but I mean, it's
Yeah,
interesting, yeah.
yeah, I definitely see that. So you're saying like it kind of had to like reuse but like dilute like Jesus's ideas in order to like appeal to like the to everyone, right, to the herd, right,
Yeah,
instead of
you're
just
right.
a few
Right,
people.
right, right. As soon as you shift from, you know, an individual, right, where you got an individual that's standing for something that sort of, is sort of creative, right? And then you move from that further and further into this sort of this dynamics of the herd. Um, you get all these things which to him are more and more base and and decadent. It's like there's this direct correlation between, right, moving away from sort of um the individual creativity to its opposite.
Well, that's another thing, because when it talks about Jesus, it's like he's super closed off, right? He's like as individual as you can possibly be. Like his sense of self is like super tiny within himself, right? To where he can't interact with anyone at all, basically. That's kind of how I
Yeah,
understood it anyway. So he was like hyper, very much individualized. And then when he was, yeah, I definitely I see what you're saying. I agree with that.
yeah. But so for Nietzsche, what was missing from Jesus was this sort of this movement of self-overcoming, right? Of saying, okay, rather than just sort of flatten everything in terms of in the direction of some sort of absolute acceptance and withdrawal from any kind of conflict, or you can sort of you need to sort of you know sort of celebrate your the conflict of the drives that are always kind of like relating to each other and conflicting with each other, and inside of yourself, right? So it's like Jesus went sort of part way uh, in that direction, in that he wasn't going to play this game of judgment and eternal damnation and all the those moralisms, but um, his psychological stance was one that just sort of flattens the psyche into these values that are absolutely passive, and you know um, and they end up being anti-life in themselves, because they don't you know they're not celebrating and appreciating the necessity of sort of of conflict, even inner conflict, right? Of yeah. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
What did I do? Oh, okay, never mind. Yeah, so I think it's definitely very. I guess it goes back to like Nietzsche's idea of the Ubermensch is very much like an individual person, right? It's not like what it's like what he wants to do is kind of will like a lot of people, like a lot of like I don't want to say a lot of Ubermenches, but something like that, right? He's not saying like he wants it's kind of difficult to explain. Like he's not like anti like individual, I guess is to say, right? Because he keeps talking about like individual like people like this throughout history. If
Yeah.
that yeah
Yeah. Well, I think it's like, almost like a two-step process. The first step is to break the individual off from the herd, dependence on the herd, or break away from this kind of thinking which imposes, sort of the social norms that just sort of fit over everybody, and
yeah
dictate, our values. So that'll be the first step. But the second step is, even once, so now, once you've gotten to the point where now you're dealing, you're starting with the individual, it's just important then for Nietzsche to then say, well, there is no real self as some sort of a, you know, because you can make the same mistake even once you sort of move past the herd and now you're focusing on the individual. You can reify the individual in the same way that that the herd was reified, and so so for Nietzsche, it's important to kind of say, well, this so-called self or the individual is still a society within itself, a society of conflicting drives, right? Um, and so you're never getting past. You don't want to ever get past this notion of sort of this dynamic, conflicting, ever-changing, and self-differentiating kind of basis, right? And arriving at the individual doesn't allow you to escape from that. That doesn't give you shelter from that. That dynamism. It just sort of resituates it in a way that's even more. It gives it even more impetus, right? For transformation.
Yeah. Yeah, I get, yeah. Yeah, I think yeah. So yeah, so it is kind of hard to say like what the end goal would be, right then, because you're right, it isn't just like becoming like hyper individualized like the way he describes Jesus. It would be something like even further than that,
Yeah,
but like not like no form at all really, like no organization, no symbols, no anything.
yeah. And of course, I mean, there are distinctly different camps of interpretation of Nietzsche. Sort of existentialists that embrace him, and in one direction will say, no, it's about self-actualization and self-fulfillment. So it's kind of this existentialist sort of enriching whatever direction the subject wants to go in. Whereas sort of the post-structuralist interpretation of Nietzsche, the way that people like Deleuze and Foucault embrace him, and even Heidegger, they say, no. It's he's not an existentialist. He's trying to sort of deconstruct that notion of this subject that so self-actualization wouldn't be that there's already this set of purposes and you're trying to optimize the direction you already want to go in, right? I mean, when
Yeah,
you read like Klosowski is really good at showing that it's like the self is always you know it's always a different person, right? I mean, um, there is no whatever self there was with whatever particular sets of aims and purposes is going to change, right? It's going to be, there's going to be this continual sort of unraveling of, who I was yesterday. Um, so yeah, so that's a really different, I mean, that's a very different way of reading Nietzsche than some of the older accounts of Nietzsche that you find in people like Kaufman and
I will say like when he was describing Jesus, it very much did sound like the self-actualization thing. But also, I mean, Jesus is also like kind of like a mythical figure, and also like so it's not clear that that's what he's saying is like yeah like it. So it is different, but that's just kind of like how I read it at first, at least.
yeah, no, yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna do what time? It is 1:41. Yeah, let me just do 38, and then I'll go just to make sure we don't like bump heads with Brooke with Brooks. Okay. So 38. I won't hold back a sigh at this point. There are days when I am haunted by a feeling that is blacker. Sorry. There are days when I am haunted by a feeling that is blacker than the blackest melancholy, a contempt for humanity. And just to prove any doubts about what I despise, who I despise, people these days, the people I have been fated to call my contemporaries, people these days, I feel suffocated by their filthy breath. Like all researchers, I have a lot of tolerance for the past, which is to say, exercise generous self-restraint. I go through the madhouse worlds of whole millennia, whether they are called Christianity, Christian faith, or the Christian church, with a sort of bleak caution. I am careful not to hold humanity responsible for its mental illnesses, but my feelings suddenly change and erupt as soon as as soon as I come to more recent times, to our times, our age knows better. What used to be just sickness is indecency today. It is indecent to be a Christian these days, and this is where my disgust begins. I look around. There are no words left for what used to be called truth. We cannot stand to hear priests even mention the word truth anymore. These days, anyone with even the most modest claim to honesty has to know has to know that every sentence pronounced by a theologian, a priest, a pope is not only a wrong, it is a lie, and he is not free to lie out of innocence or ignorance anymore. The priest knows as well as anyone that there is no God anymore, that there is no such thing as sin or the Redeemer, that free will and the moral world order are lies. The seriousness, the profound self-overcoming of spirit does not allow people not to know this anymore. All church concepts are known for what they are, the most malicious counterfeits that exist to devalue nature and natural values. The priests themselves are known for what they are, the most dangerous type of parasite, the true poisonous spider of life. We know our conscience as sorry, we know our con- consciences are conscious of it these days. Just what values these uncanny sorry, just what values those uncanny inventions of the priests and the church have, how they were used to reduce humanity to such a state of self-desecration that the sight of it fills you with disgust. The concepts beyond, last judgment, immortality of the soul itself. These are instruments of torture. These are systems of cruelty that enable the priest to gain control, maintain control. Everyone knows this, and yet everything goes on as before. Where are the remnants of self-respect or any sense of decency when even our statesmen, who are generally very impartial and thoroughly anti-Christian in practice, still call themselves Christian and take communion? A young prince at the head of his regiments, whose magnificence is an expression of the selfishness and self-importance of his people. He calls himself Christian without a hint of shame. So who exactly does Christianity negate? What does it consider worldly? The fact that these people are soldiers, judges, patriots, and they define themselves, that they defend their honor, that they do what is best for themselves, that they are proud. Every practice at this moment, every practice at every moment, every instinct, every value judgment that people act on is anti-Christian these days. What miscarriages of duplicity modern people are, that in spite of all this, they are not ashamed to call themselves Christians. So that was yeah, that was a very yeah, he seems a little bit angry for sure. Um, but I think the gist is that like it's not just that like modern people like know better and they're but it's like they're kind of like disavowing, right? Like everything they do is anti-Christian and yet they still call themselves Christian and like kind of inspire like the same. But do you have something to say?
Um, yeah, and well, I think like in Genealogy of Morality, where he points out that, like socialism and modern science still, I mean, it has remnants within it of that whole Christian morality. It's just sort of displaced, onto secular terms, but the core of it, the model of it is still Christian. I mean, he's saying something a little bit different here because he's literally saying, no, they still, they're still going to say, oh, I consider myself a Christian, which is a little bit different. But,
Yeah.
even those that would say, well, I'm an atheist and I disavow Christianity, Nietzsche would point to them and say, well, even here, maybe you've taken a half step, further away from, that Christian mentality, but there's still a lot of it, that's still circulating inside of yourself. Even if
Yeah.
you're a avowed, Marxist, atheist, socialist.
Yeah, and here it says like so who exactly does Christianity negate? What does it consider worldly, right? Since if every single person is a Christian, then what is Christianity actually like doing? What is it preventing you from doing, right?
Right.
Like what could possibly be considered, pious if every single person can and is a Christian, right?
Right.
Um But so I do think there's definitely that part where he's saying like there's Christianity in everything, but he's also saying like the people who are like profoundly like anti-Christian or doing stuff that the the teachings of Jesus would never like respect, are still calling themselves Christian, or using like Christian language, which and he's finding, you know, and he's saying like, why are they not ashamed to use this language? Like, why hasn't this been like, you know, been trampled over enough to make people like no longer respect it? Is kind of what I'm getting from it.
Yeah.
Uh, I think I'm gonna end it there. Just yeah, but yeah. This is a good reading. And we stopped at 39. Yeah. Goodbye, everyone.